So welcome everybody. I'm Martin Cloake, the CEO here at Raven, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining our webinar, How Renaissance Built a Frontline-First Approach to Continuous Improvement. I spent a lot of my career in tech, but I was fortunate to spend the first 5 years of my career working in manufacturing, and actually spent more than a year in Lakewood, New Jersey, where Justin's from, and we'll make sure that this conversation doesn't focus on our love of Lakewood, New Jersey. So I'll kick things over to Justin to introduce yourself. Go for it, Justin.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin Brennan. I'm the Director of Operational Excellence here at Lakewood, as the slide says. I joined Renaissance Lakewood about 3 years ago. I'm an engineer by background. I spent time in process design, manufacturing, and also consulting. So as I joked with Martin before, please don't hold that against me, but it's where I learned a lot of the lean Six Sigma type stuff as well. So it's been a good journey so far.
Yeah, and I think the background in consulting is interesting. We can dive into this later, but ultimately, to drive improvement, you need to be able to influence, to create change as well as capture data, and we'll jump into that in a second. So, for the first key theme today, we want to discuss democratizing data to drive frontline engagement. Now, manufacturers have never had this much data. Our challenge today is to capture meaningful data. And ultimately make it easier for our teams on the front line, whether it be our operators or supervisors or plant management, make it easier for them to identify problems and solve them quickly. And this is something that we've always struggled with. Why is data democratization important? And even from a definition perspective, I'm thinking if we were having this conversation at your plant in New Jersey, I'm not sure if we would use the word data democratization to describe this to your team, but fundamentally, data is important, but is only valuable if people actually get it. And in some cases, what's often missed is making sure that folks on the shop floor understand why we are collecting the data, understand even the meaning of that data. So yeah, what is data democratization to you and your team, and why is it important?
Yeah, so from my perspective, the data democratization is just essentially, it's a simple concept in theory, which is using the data that we collect and sharing it with the people who create it and who live with it daily, so that they get a chance to speak to it, to understand it, and really engage with it, versus just kind of throw it into what I call the data black hole, which I've seen a lot of times in plants where operators give invaluable feedback and invaluable insight, and then it just sort of never gets back to them. They don't have that feedback loop where they actually get to hear about it after they put it all in there. So what we've been focusing on was the challenges that we've had with that. And I think a lot of it was really just for us around building trust, and really making sure that we were able to show our operating team that we care about their insights, we care about what they gave us, and kind of shared it with them as well, so that they got to be part of the process rather than just an input to it and feeling like they were completely left behind.
So I guess building trust here, because in some ways, do you have an example of a scenario where you were able to to build that trust early on? Because I think one thing that I know from my time in manufacturing is that there is a distrust of anything new, and I think it's human nature to resist change here. So I guess an example of a time when you were able to actually had that magical moment when somebody actually sort of finally saw that the data that they are putting into the system was being used in a way that made sense to them.
Yeah, we've had a couple different examples, I think, with Raven and prior to our implementation of it. But on the Raven side, I think when we actually brought the operators to a computer screen and showed them, the data they were collecting and what we were doing with it on a specific packaging line that we were trying to improve, asking them questions about it and explaining how our engineering team was going to use the data they gave us to address the most pressing issues that we saw from that. It sounds really, really simple, and it is in practice, which is just, we went back and through respect and through treating them like people, we kind of said, okay, here's the information you gave us. And they kind of lit up a little bit and said, oh, wow. Not only did they come out and actually talk to us and have a regular conversation about it, but they're listening to what we're seeing and trying to understand the pain we go through daily in trying to do our jobs and have a little bit of predictability in how our day is going to go. So what we started seeing was they would pull me aside and start to show me things on the line that they were dealing with for years that they haven't really had a chance to get fixed, because they felt like they weren't being heard. So it's a constant, you constantly have to engage, and it's not just something you do one off and then have this kind of epiphany and everything works. But through constant engagement and regular discussion, I started to see people change their approach a little bit, and it was really, really insightful and helpful.
This particular dynamic when operators and leadership together look at the timeline of a day. So one of the things with Raven and is that we capture a timeline of all the events that have happened in the day, whether it is producing, getting ready to produce, waiting, or dealing with something that's broken. And often what happens is that there's a disconnect between what management and engineering continuous improvement thinking about. They see, for example, that an operator has lost 45 minutes waiting for, a part to be fixed. And there's sort of a kind of the operators with this sort of grin on their face going like, I told you that this was the thing that was slowing me down. And leadership going like, oh, that's interesting. And there's that connection point where everybody suddenly realizes that they're all playing off of the same sheet music. And the thing that needs to be addressed is this thing. So I guess early on, is there a specific example of when you were able to get those kinds of moments? And I'd be interested to understand also how this fit in with your particular approach to continuous improvement as you began to try and institute these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a great example of that. So our continuous improvement platform, it's kind of a joint base of, obviously we talked about the people side of it, but we also need to be data driven. So we recently did a value add, non-value add assessment on one of our filling lines. And what we actually did was we pulled the Raven data up and we walked through it with the operators and said, look, we can see the start time, we can see the breaks, we can see all these things. It's not meant to be a mystery or anything, but what we want to understand is the why behind it. So by taking these start times and looking at the actual Raven timeline and working with our operating team, we were able to understand that we had variability when we started. And it sounds really simple. And, again, this is all going to sound very basic at the end of it, but having that conversation with them and asking them, why is it so hard to start up, or what are the issues you run into, and then doing the Gemba walks and doing the observations and having that on the floor follow up with them, and then having the conversations afterwards as well. The data itself provided the platform for the discussion because it became less subjective in terms of we need to make more, we have to go faster and all that kind of stuff. And it was more about, okay, we see what your day looks like.
You highlight an interesting point here because, you've described kind of the concept of the problem, and then there is, performance, and performance is really a collection of, your what went well plus what didn't go well, and that's your performance. And I think when the conversation centers around performance, this is when you kind of get the finger pointing. But I think for most, for many of us who've worked manufacturing and in other fields, once you clearly define that problem and throw that problem down on the table, this is the point where instinctively we all kind of think about what we can do to solve that problem. And I think that the power of clearly identifying a problem or the root cause of inefficiencies is very strong. And then it's human nature to solve problems once defined. And I think that's a key thing. And I actually know that your alma mater, I read an article recently from McKinsey kind of describing how, one of the key things that manufacturers are struggling with isn't implementing technology or implementing change. It's knowing where to start. So to be able to understand your organization holistically sufficiently to say, if I'm going to pick one spot to start, I'm going to start, in this area. And one of the things that often happens, and we see when we work with clients, is that there's often a misconception around what the biggest opportunity is. And if you spend your days looking at machine data, you often think that the root cause of losses is machine losses. So for those of us who spent time in manufacturing, it's about relationships. And I think the more that we can spend having these data-informed conversations with our folks on the shop floor, the easier it is to create that engagement. And then once we have that engagement, focus our activity and our energy on solving our most important problems here. But it kind of comes back to that, that fundamental principle where you start with people, you give them good process, and at the end, find the kinds of tools to support this. Doing things in that order works. Doing things in the opposite order does not work. And many organizations are struggling by focusing on tools first rather than people first. So I guess we have a couple more minutes on this topic before moving on here. But I guess any other insights about the challenges just to begin to collect data. I guess the transition prior to collaborating with Raven. My understanding here was that you're collecting data in a way that many manufacturers do, which is through a combination of manual systems and I guess whiteboards, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately Excel. Everything, all ships lead to, all roads lead to Excel, right?
I was going to say Excel is the new Rome nowadays, where all roads lead there, fortunately or unfortunately. So I think, you know, when I first started here, we didn't have an OpEx department. This was something that we were building up from the ground floor. So obviously, what we started out with was, what data do we need and what data do we have? So walking the lines and talking to the operators, we saw some rudimentary whiteboards and some data capture systems, but they often didn't reflect what was actually happening. The data wasn't being captured. There was no sort of historian, if you will. And essentially, at the end of the day, the operators felt like it was just sort of a nuisance task that they had to do, and you know, it wasn't really providing any value. So quickly, we started to say, okay, at least on things like the shift report, how can we capture that data, and how can we start to share it with people? And then from there, we sort of transitioned into the idea of, okay, the line-based community, the line side board and the pacing board and things like that. How can we get smarter about that? And one of the gentlemen here I work with had talked about, you know, Raven. He had heard about this OE software that we had, or OE hardware and system, and he wanted to see if we could bring it in. And I said, okay, this is perfect, a great opportunity for us to start to measure how we're performing a little bit better, pilot it, and then start to share that data and build that culture of continuous improvement by having these conversations that are centered around data. So it's less of that performance talk about, you know, did we make enough of this, or do we make enough of that, and more about, okay, how did it run overall? And I think you hit on something previously, which is kind of one of my core tenets, which is, if you think about manufacturing, the plant itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So the data will tell part of the story, but it'll give you the symptoms, but not always the actual diagnosis of what the root cause of the problem is. So what we worked on with a lot of that was understanding how the different moving parts inside our company work together, and what the data could tell us in conjunction with those conversations. And at the end of the day, going back to the challenge we faced, it was essentially engaging people and getting them to believe that this was going to be different. Because the other answer you hear a lot of times, and I'm sure you've run into this, is, we tried something like that before, we tried this exact thing before and it failed, so I'm not going to engage. And it was really just having that open and honest conversation to say, look, I know this may not feel like it's going to work, but let's try it, and let's try something different, and let's fail forward. Let's fail forward together. And if it doesn't work, it's all of us together, and we'll make it better and try again.